All right. Hey, good morning, Summit Church. Great to see all of you here this morning. My name is Andy. I'm one of the pastors here. To begin, a question for you. How many of you were good test takers growing up? You know, whether it was the ACT or the SAT. Yeah, how many of those, it's okay to brag a little bit. How many of those things, how many of it just came natural to you? Raise your hand. All right. How many of you were classic overthinkers? And you would get to, you'd get to one of those questions and all of a sudden you would turn into full-blown philosophical or psychological mode. You know, they could be asking this or they could be asking that, you know, all for a simple math equation. Any of you? Yeah. You know what that feels like. You know, it's like you'd have all these questions. You know, my kids just finished their state testing just a few weeks ago. And I told them, I said, guys, here's the reality, because kids these days, I don't know if you realize this, it's all done on computers. All right, they do all of their state testing on, on screens, and they're right there. And I said, listen, you guys are getting soft. All right, you don't know what it's like to spend hours just filling in little bubbles with your number 2 pencil until your hand starts cramping up to irreversible damage, right? That's a core childhood memory that you're missing out on. And they didn't care at all. Life is full of tests, though, isn't it? Life is full of tests. Well, we know this. You know, if you want to be able to drive, you got to go through a test. If you want certain occupations, you got to take a test. Or sometimes you got to take multiple tests, a whole series of tests, right? If you want to get married, well, actually, that's one of those things you don't have to take a test, do you? You probably should, but you don't have to take a test. In fact, true story, I was talking to a friend just last week. They said they're getting married, and all they had to do is go to the courthouse, sign a piece of paper. The only thing you're required to prove is that you're not related. Yeah, exactly. All they did is they said, are you related? And they said, no. I said, are you sure? And they said, yeah. I said, all right, here you go. Stamped. You're done. All right, life is full of tests. Well, over the last few weeks, we have been walking through the book of Genesis and the life of Joseph. And Joseph's life is just really a series of tests. From the moment that we first meet Joseph at 17 years old, it's really just test after test after test. And Joseph faces some really, really difficult tests early on, because Joseph grew up in a very dysfunctional family. Now, don't raise your hand for this one, but how many of you grew up in a dysfunctional family? All right, some of you are raising your hand. Okay, it proves that you grew up in that family. You can't follow instructions, can you? All right, you know what it's like, though. You know, it's like mom had issues with this, and dad had struggles with this, and there were secrets, and there were struggles, and there were all kinds of problems. You're always testing one another in those environments, aren't you? Right? Well, whose side are you on? You know, do you really love me? You know, if I do this for you, you will do this for me. These are all just different types of relational tests. Well, if you want to go ahead and begin turning to Genesis 42, that's where we're going to be at this morning. Genesis 42, that's page 32 on the Bibles that we provide. Today, we're going to see Joseph test his brothers. And why does he test them? Well, he tests them for the same reason that we still test people today. I mean, really, this is the heart of the passage. This is the heart of the whole story that we're going to see this morning. Joseph tests his brothers to see if they can be trusted. The reason you're tested to see is to see if you can be trusted. And we know how this works. You know, for example, some of you might oversee people at work. And particularly if you got a new employee, what do? You know, you give them an assignment, you give them a certain project to work on, you give them a specific task, and what is that? It really is just a test, isn't it? It's a test to see, like, all right, are you able to do the job? Are you able to complete the project in the way that I want to see it completed? Or we do this relationally, don't we? You know, imagine you're dating somebody. And what is dating other than just one long test, right? You know, like, are we compatible? How do we do together? But at some point in a dating relationship, I mean, this happens all the time. At some point in a dating relationship, you have to have a conversation. I see this often. You have to have a conversation at some point, and you have to tell them, here's what I need you to know about me. Here's what I need to tell you. Here's something from my past that I really haven't told anybody. What is that? That's a test. That's a test. How are you going to deal with that information? Are you still going to love me? Are you still going to love me now that you know what you know about me? And look, here's why we're talking about all of this today. This is very, 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 very important for all of us, because at some point in your life, if you live long enough and if you love enough people, at some point, somebody's going to break your trust. Or you might actually be the person breaking somebody else's trust, unfortunately. But at some point, somebody is going to break your trust. I mean, this is just a reality of life. Right? At some point in life, somebody's going to break your trust in a really significant way. But in that moment, and really in kind of all of the moments that follow after that, you have a decision to make. How will I, as a follower of Jesus Christ, how will I, as someone who's been the recipient of God's grace and God's forgiveness and God's mercy, how will I respond to the people in my life who have hurt me when they later need me? Because look, this is almost a universal principle. I mean, this tends to be the way that the world works today. At some point in life, the people who have hurt you will later show up and need you. I'll show you exactly what I mean by that in just a moment as we study the life of Joseph here. But today I want to show you that that's exactly the scenario that's going to unfold in Joseph's life. And it's one of those experiences and one of those encounters that all of us are going to experience at some point as well, if you haven't already. Now today we're going to be looking at chapter 42. So if you want to turn there, chapter 42 is where we're beginning. In fact, I'm going to back up just a little bit. Let's start at the end of 41, just to get a little bit of the context of what's happening here. In verse 53 of chapter 41, it says this. It says, "The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said." Now, if you were here last week, you might remember that Joseph was brought out of prison, right? He gave this extraordinary speech to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was so impressed that he elevated him to be the number 2 leader in the entire nation of Egypt. He's now the governor of Egypt, and he told Pharaoh in this speech that this is exactly what would happen, right? There are going to be 7 great years, economic prosperity, followed by 7 years of famine, and that's where we are right now. It says there was famine in all the lands. That means that was more than just Egypt, right? It was the surrounding nations as well. But in all the land of Egypt, there was bread. And that's because Joseph had put together this phenomenal strategic plan for the entire nation. All right, verse 55, "When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, 'Go to Joseph, what he says to you, do.'" Now, I'm going to stop right there just because it just occurred to me this morning, like a few hours ago. I was just reading over this passage one more time, preparing. And you know what? I read that line. You know what it reminded me of? I hadn't seen this all week in preparing this. But that sentence, it reminded me of Jesus and his first miracle. Anybody remember what Jesus' first miracle was? Water into wine. Right, he turned the water into wine. Remember, he was at a wedding, and they ran out of wine. And then there were all the servants there, and then Jesus' mother was there. And what happened? Remember, this is like, "Hey, Jesus, we ran out of wine." And Jesus' mother said to the servants, do you remember what she said? She goes, "Here's Jesus. Do whatever he tells you to do." I thought that was so neat. I was like, this is exactly what's happening right here. And then all of a sudden, we saw Jesus provide in a miraculous way in the same way that Joseph is going to begin providing for the entire land of Egypt. The reason why I bring that up is because this whole story, I've told you this from the very first week of this series, this whole story, Joseph is somebody who's pointing us to Jesus. Joseph is somebody who's supposed to remind us, we're supposed to look at the story of Joseph and be like, "Oh, that sounds like somebody I know. That reminds me of somebody I've heard of. That reminds me of Jesus." All right, that's the only reason I point that out. Verse 56 says, "When the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was severe over all the earth." In other words, this is a really, really bad situation. I mean, really to global proportions here. People are becoming desperate. You know, we all kind of do weird things when we're desperate, don't we? Especially when we're desperate and hungry. That's a bad combination. So that's the situation right now. And then we step into Genesis chapter 42. Here's how chapter 42 begins. It says, "When Jacob learned," remember Jacob is the father of Joseph, "when Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, 'Why do you look at one another?'" Isn't that a great question? They're like, "What are y'all doing? Why are you just staring at each other right now? We're starving and you're just sitting around staring at each other. Go do something." And he said, verse 2, "Behold, I've heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there that we may live and not die." Now, this is actually interesting. We have to ask the question hey, what exactly are the brothers doing right now? Why is it that they're actually just sitting there staring at each other, kind of stalling the whole situation? Why are they not doing anything about this whole thing? And I think the reality is it's pretty clear. They're avoiding Egypt. All right, they're avoiding Egypt. Why are they avoiding Egypt? Well, there are probably a couple reasons. First of all, it's just not convenient at all. I mean, Egypt was about 300 miles away. That'd be a 600-mile journey, probably take about 6 weeks. And sorry, it's about 300 miles away, and it was about a 6-week journey for them to get there. So, and it's dangerous, it's not very convenient, a lot of risk involved. This would not be the type of trip that you would be excited about taking, all right? So first of all, it's just convenient. But when you're starving and you're desperate, you're willing to do all kinds of things that are inconvenient. So there had to be something else. There had to be something deeper in that moment. I think it's because Egypt is not just some far off country. I think it's because Egypt represents their deepest family secret. Egypt, for these brothers, is synonymous with unconfessed sin. Why? Well, because the last time that we saw Egypt and these brothers mentioned in the same sentence, it's when they had sold their brother Joseph into slavery on the way to Egypt on the back of a camel, right? And as much as they tried to cover their tracks, as much as they tried to sweep this all under the rug, I mean, we know they have not forgotten about this. They have not moved on, even 20 years later. Why? Well, this is what we're seeing here. It really doesn't matter how much time passes. Unconfessed sin will always haunt you. And the same way it has haunted these brothers, we're going to see this in just a moment. When you're covering something up, or when you're hiding something, when you're not willing to go to that place and that thing that's in the darkness and you're not willing to bring it into the light, it doesn't matter how many strategies you try. It doesn't matter how all the pretending that you do. Unconfessed sin, unconfessed secrets will never leave you alone. They really won't. I say this lovingly, but they will haunt you until the day you die. Unless you do something about them. I mean, Jesus talked about the same reality, didn't he? He tells us, I think it's Luke chapter 8, when Jesus says that anything that is concealed will be revealed. It is going to show up at some point. And it either comes out voluntarily because you bring it out, or it comes out the hard way. Now, on the other side of that, one of the really encouraging things is that Jesus' best friend, John, the Apostle John, he'll later tell us that if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. So on one hand, this is a warning, but this is also a promise. This is kind of both things happening at the same time. He's trying to wake us up here. And this is the situation for Joseph's brothers. Joseph's brothers were reluctant to go to Egypt because they knew Egypt, that was synonymous with unconfessed sin. That was synonymous with a deep family secret. All right, but then verse 3, what happens? It says, the 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Now remember, Benjamin was Jacob's youngest son. All right, he had already lost his favorite son from his favorite wife, so he was not going to allow this to happen to Benjamin as well. Now, verse 5, thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now, Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them. Now, can you just imagine what that must have been like in that moment? Suddenly, you've got these 10 brothers who come in, and they're obvious Hebrews. They've got the beards. They've got the Hebrew accents. Joseph's there. He sees them come in. Imagine what that must have been like in that moment. Joseph saw them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. I imagine in that moment, he just kind of froze. And I was like, oh my goodness. Like, what do I do? What do I say? He spoke roughly to them. Where do you come from? He said. They said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. They're confirming what he thought. And then Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Joseph would have looked like an Egyptian at this point. He would have had a shaved head. He would have a shaved beard, maybe have one of the fake goatee things that the Egyptians did, all the makeup. That's what Joseph would have looked like. There would have been no way. And also, we're told later that he was speaking through a translator. All right, so he's able to speak Egyptian. They have no idea, but Joseph knows. And then Joseph, at verse 9, Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. All of a sudden, the tables have turned, haven't they? All of a sudden, here's Joseph. He's governor of Egypt, second in command. I mean, he's got all the power, right? He's got all the authority, and here are his brothers, desperate, tired, exhausted, hungry, bowing down before him. They have no idea who he is. So what do you do? What do you do? I mean, one word, and all these guys could be eliminated, right? One word, and you can make them disappear, and nobody would ever ask any questions at all. But here they are, bowing before you. You see what's happening here? Suddenly, the guys that hurt him the most are at his mercy. Suddenly, the guys who hurt him the most, they need something from him. What do you do in a moment like that? Let me tell you why this is just so important. I mean, this is so applicable for all of us today because at some point in your life, you are going to be deeply hurt by somebody in your life. Somebody's going to break your trust. Somebody's going to turn their back. Somebody's going to hurt you and leave you to pick up all of the pieces on your own. And for whatever reason, I mean, this just, again, it seems to be the way that the world tends to work today. For whatever reason, the people who have hurt you the most, they will often resurface in your life and need something that you have. I mean, this could be mom or dad, who just didn't maybe show up the way that mom or dad were supposed to show up, particularly in the years of your life that really matter the most. You know, and they made some really bad decisions that really affected you. You know, and you were neglected, and you were forgotten, and you were hurt. And as soon as you got the chance, maybe you were one of those people that said, hey, I'm out of here. I'm moving to Denver, right? I'm getting out of this place. Or maybe you just grew up in that type of home where it was dad who made those decisions early on. He made some reckless decisions that absolutely ruined your childhood, and he's the one that got up and left, leaving you all alone. But now you're an adult, right? And maybe you've kind of stabilized a little bit and you've gotten a little bit healthier. And all of a sudden, somehow, at some point, they pop back into your life. They're a little bit older now and they need your help. What do you do? This could be a friend that really let you down, that for whatever reason, you just feel so betrayed by. Right? You promised me this. You told me that. We agreed to this. You cut me out. You went behind my back. We agreed, but you didn't hold up your end of the bargain. And suddenly, years later, you know, you've moved on and you've gotten better. You've gotten into a good place again, but then he shows up or she shows up and out of nowhere, and they have the audacity to ask you for help. What do you do? In those moments, I mean, you have a very significant decision to make, don't you? Right? It's a very difficult decision, maybe the most difficult decision you could make, because if you're a follower of Jesus in particular, you know, not only do you have your faith and you have the way of Jesus and your understanding of the gospel, but you have all of those things colliding with the emotions that you're probably feeling inside, and you'll have to answer the question that we all have to answer at some point. How do I respond to the people who have hurt me when they later need me? It's a very difficult question, isn't it? And it tends to be a question that we often don't do too well in answering. But look, Joseph, I mean, he's about to deal with this very thing. He's about to walk through this very situation, and he recognizes his brothers, but they don't recognize him. And so what Joseph does here, I mean, he's going to test his brothers in order to figure out if he can trust them. That's what's going to happen. He's going to test them and to figure out if he can trust them. Now, personally, here's my interpretation when I read this. I think Joseph has already forgiven them. Okay, I think he's already done that hard work. I think, you know, he spent so many years in prison that he did this hard work years ago when he was sitting in a jail cell, just wondering and doing that hard work with God. I think years ago he forgave them. But I think at this point, he's in a place now where he's asking himself the question, can we be reconciled? Can this relationship be restored? Can we have something again? I mean, again, this is all of us at some point, right? You find yourself in a conflict with somebody. You find yourself maybe even years down the road saying, okay, hey, can we do this? Can I trust you? Can we actually be restored into a relationship again? And we ask all the questions, you know, because that is a really difficult thing to navigate, particularly in your adult life, to figure out, hey, these were relationships that once meant a lot to me, and all of a sudden they don't mean, you know, and here's the reality. In those situations, what most often surfaces in those moments is just a real desire for things to be the way that they once were, right? And here's, you know, newsflash, you'll never have them the way that they once were. On some regard, that's actually good news, though. Because if you think about it, anytime you're going through relational conflict and relational pain, and the desire is just to have what you once had, the reality is what you once had was probably a premature or superficial expression of the depth of a relationship that you could have. Right? Because you hadn't gone through all of the really, really hard seasons of betrayal and pain. That's why oftentimes when I meet with a couple that's older, and they look back on their lives, and they look back on the ways that they've gone through hard things, they realize, hey, what we have now, if God's grace has really moved in and brought a tremendous amount of healing, what they're able to say at this point in their lives is not, hey, I wish I had what we once had when we were 20 years old. No, it's, hey, what we have now is actually a much deeper, a much richer expression of love. Because God has brought such healing into this relationship. We're experiencing something now that is far better than what we once had. I think that's possible, all right? So that verse 9 then, Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them, and he said to them, you are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land. All right, he's testing them here. And they said to him, no, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. That's true. We are honest men. That's not true. They've been lying for 20 years. In fact, that phrase, honest men, that's going to pop up 3 different times in this whole passage, and it's a very, very important thing. I mean, honesty, gosh, when it comes to reconciliation and healing and trust, restoring trust, I mean, honesty is such a crucial part of all of this, isn't it? It's no surprise. It's not coincidental. All of this is very intentional. That phrase pops up multiple times. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies. That's probably true. I don't think they're smart enough to do that. He said to them, no, it is the nakedness of the land that you have come to see. And they said, we, your servants, are 12 brothers. All right, they're actually starting to get a little bit more honest. The sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more. But Joseph said to them, it is as I said to you, you are spies. By this you shall be tested. All right, so he tells them, I'm going to test you. All right, you're going to be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you and let him bring your brother, that's Benjamin, while you remain confined, that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you. Or else, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. And he put them all together in custody for 3 days, right to the prison. I can't help but to think Joseph probably at that moment was like, hey, I want to introduce you to a friend of mine, Mr. Warden. I got to know him really well. You're about to get to know him really well too. So he's testing his brothers. In fact, what you see is he's going to give them 2 tests. All right, 2 tests that he's going to show us today. The first test here is the test of sincerity. Test of sincerity. He's trying to get below the surface with these brothers. He wants to know how they really feel 20 years later and whether or not anything has genuinely changed. So he puts them in prison for 3 days. And what happens when you sit in a cell for 3 days? I mean, some of you maybe have experienced that before. I mean, you can't do anything but sit and think. And so on the 3rd day, Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. Interesting comment that he makes to them there. But he says, verse 19, if you are honest men, there it is again, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me. So your words will be verified, and you shall not die. And they did so. And then they said to one another, in truth, look at this. This is amazing. I mean, they're standing in front of Joseph. They're speaking Hebrew because they don't think he can understand, right? They've been using a translator the whole time. And this is what they say. They say, in truth, we are guilty. Who says that? Only people who actually know that they are in fact guilty. He says, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us and we did not listen. Suddenly a flashback all the way 20 years ago when Joseph was in the pit. That is why this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered them, did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. You see what's happening here? I mean, this is amazing. Their consciences are being awakened. You know, they say, in truth, we are guilty. What is that? That's like a profession or even a confession that this secret, this sin that they've been hiding for 20 long years, it has never left them alone. I mean, it has haunted them from their souls, really, from the moment that they did it. And Joseph here, I mean, he not only gets to see it, he gets to hear it from their very lips in that moment. I mean, this all would have been brand new information for Joseph. right? The fact that Reuben had not consented to Joseph's sale into slavery, that would have been brand new information. The fact that they were not as hardened as he had thought, that his cries for help had been haunting them all of these years. Even with 2 decades passing by, they could not shake the guilt that they've carried. I heard somebody say this week, guilt is to the soul what pain is to the body. Guilt is to the soul what pain is to the body. And the reality is, it never goes away until it's fully dealt with, right? In fact, if it's not dealt with, what happens? It only gets worse. They've carried this guilt with them for 20 years. And again, it just shows us that unconfessed sin will always haunt us. Well, Joseph is watching all this unfold. He understands every word of it. And then verse 23, they did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. And then he turned away from them and wept. And guys, this is such a powerful moment. Joseph is just completely overwhelmed with emotion. Why? Because his brothers have been humanized again. Right in front of him. Have you ever experienced conflict with someone, and especially if there's time and distance that seems to pass, if it's not dealt with, what happens? They just tend to grow bigger, or they grow into bigger and bigger villains within your mind, don't they? They become worse and worse caricatures of themselves. It's kind of like if you've ever seen one of those street artists who draws caricatures, what are they doing? They tend to pick out one of your flaws, or many of your flaws, and they exaggerate them, right, to comic proportions. Have you ever done that before? I've never done that. I don't have enough courage to do that. But it's funny when it's a street artist. But when you exaggerate the flaws of another person to epic proportions, that's terrible, isn't it? None of us likes the feeling of that being done to us. Joseph's brothers in this very moment, they are being rehumanized, and it has such an effect on him that he breaks down and weeps. Again, this is just part of the process of healing and reconciliation and restoring trust with somebody that you've got conflict with. Again, we tend to exaggerate somebody's weaknesses. We tend to get to a place where we, even just insert all kinds of false motivations into the narrative, right? This is why they did this, and this is why they said, I know exactly how they think. I know why, if you've ever been the recipient of that, you know how extraordinarily painful that can feel, right? It's like, I didn't do any of that. That wasn't the reason why I did that. That is totally blown out of proportion. And Joseph returned to them, and he spoke to them, and he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. And Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to replace every man's money in his sack and to give them provisions for the journey. This was done for them. Now, something's happening here. All right? He takes Simeon, he binds him up, throws him into custody, but he let the brothers go. Now, scholars tell us what's happening here is Joseph is actually reenacting his own story. Right? He's giving the brothers what they wanted, right? The food and the money, but he's holding back a brother. Why? Well, he's doing this to test them, to see how much they actually cared, and to see how sincere they actually were in this moment. Would they abandon another brother like they had previously done, or have they changed? Well, this chapter closes with them returning back to their father Jacob, and they're shocked to find that all of their money had been returned. They're startled. They're actually kind of scared by the whole thing. But they make it home. They tell Jacob, except that they're unwilling to confess still what they had done to Joseph 20 years earlier. The secret remains a secret. So here's what has to happen. We'll go to chapter 43 now. It says, the famine was severe in the land. Verse 2, and when they had eaten the grain that they had brought from Egypt, their father said to them, go again, buy us a little food. But Judah said to him, and Judah's going to become a very important person in the story, all right? Judah's going to really step up, and he's actually going to be an important character. We'll see in a minute. This is what Judah says. He says, the man, that's Joseph, solemnly warned us, saying, you shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. He's talking about Benjamin. If you will send our brother with us, we will go down back to Egypt and buy you food. But if you will not send him, we will not go down. For the man said to us, you shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. Now, we've already seen this, but Jacob has no interest in sending Benjamin, right? He won't risk it. He doesn't want to allow it. He tells them no. But Judah steps up here, verse 9. He says, I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. All right, so here's what happens. Kind of fast forward a little bit through the story. Jacob says, all right, fine, go. The famine is so severe that they all take the trip back down to Egypt. They get to Joseph's house, and when they get there, they're a little scared, all right, because the whole money thing, and Joseph's been super powerful, and so they're afraid. So what they do is they go to the manager of the house, the steward of the house, and say, hey, listen, we had all this money. We brought it last time. It was somehow put back into our bags. We don't know how that happened. It's really kind of neat. They're just trying to be unbelievably honest right now. Their consciences have been awakened. They're trying to do the right thing. The steward of the house tells them, it's okay. We understand. We did that. Verse 26. Joseph came home. They brought into the house to him the present that they had with them and bowed down to him to the ground. And he inquired about their welfare and said, is your father well? The old man of whom you spoke, is he still alive? Which I'm sure they had to wonder, why do you keep asking us about our dad? Like, why are you so curious about this man? Why do you ask so many questions? They said, your servant, our father, is well. He's still alive. And they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves, and he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son. Then again, Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep, and he entered his chamber and wept there. At the sight of Benjamin, he could barely get the sentence out. He just broke. It hit him so hard he had to leave the room, and he broke down weeping. And this is going to happen many times in the story. In fact, 6 different times in the story, Joseph will just break down uncontrollably sobbing. Can you remember when the last time you cried was? Maybe some of you on the way to church. I don't know. Can you remember? Sometimes I meet with people, sometimes particularly men, and it's like, I don't remember the last time I've ever even cried. It's like, oh. And it's so sad. Like, what is going on in your heart that you're not moved right now? That was Joseph. He washed his face. He came out, and controlling himself, he said, serve the food. And they served him by himself and them by themselves. And the Egyptians who ate with Joseph by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. And they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in amazement. Again, they're just sitting there at the royal table, just astonished that the Egyptians had put them in this order from youngest to oldest. And it's like, how did they know? How did this happen? And what's just happening? What's happening all together? We're just a bunch of nobodies from nowhere trying to buy food. And now we're sitting at the royal table. What in the world is going on? But then look, here, this is the second test. Remember, the first test was the test of sincerity. The second test is right here in verse 34. It says, portions were taken to them from Joseph's table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs. This is the second test. This is the test of transformation. The test of transformation. This is, have you guys truly, legitimately, genuinely changed? Because last time somebody was treated better than everybody else, you guys got unbelievably jealous. And so Joseph, this is very intentional. Joseph is curious. What happens, brothers, when you're put back into that position? How are you going to respond? And that's why he gives Benjamin 5 times as much as everyone else. And granted, this is a very difficult test, all right? Because he's basically asking what all of us are always asking after someone lets us down. Have you truly changed? That's an unbelievably difficult thing to know, right? How do you know? How do you know if someone has changed? Well, first of all, do you believe that people can change? A lot of people today will tell you people don't really change. All right, you are what you are, and you will always be that. I mean, this is why some of you go home for Thanksgiving and your parents treat you like the 15-year-old version of yourself, don't they? You know, they make all the same remarks, they make all the same jokes, and sometimes it feels remarkably discouraging, right? Because you're like, I'm not that person anymore. But for some reason, hardwired into a lot of us is just this belief that people don't really change. And my goodness, I mean, I can't think of a more depressing. I cannot think of a more discouraging way to move through life than to believe you can't change. I mean, literally, it's hard for me to think of a worse mindset to bring into any relationship than people don't really change. To believe what you see is what you get forever. Listen, one of the things that you have to believe, if you're ever going to reconcile with the people who have hurt you, if you're ever going to experience a rebuilding of trust, if you're ever going to get any element of healing within those relationships, or if you just want any type of assurance personally in your own life that this isn't the way that it has to be forever, you know, that there's real hope for actual change, that there's real hope for actual growth, that, you know, I mean, do you ever get frustrated with yourself and just think, why am I this way? Right, why do I do the things that I do? You ever feel that? I mean, or what Paul says in Romans 7, why do I do the things that I don't want to do? And I don't do the things that I do want to do. Have you ever felt that before? We can't be cynical. Man, we live in such a cynical age, don't we? You have to believe that people can change. Maybe a more accurate way to say this for us is you have to believe that the Spirit of God can and does change people. And baked into our faith is the belief that God transforms. Right? God doesn't just tweak us. He completely transforms us. This is really the heart of the gospel message, right? For every single one of us. That we were dead in our sins, but then he brought us back to life by his blood. And from that moment on, what happens? From that moment on, the Spirit of God moves into your life and begins the beautiful work, the beautiful process of sanctification, just changing you, growing you, maturing you, changing you into the person that he's called you to be. Changing you into the person that he created you, that type of man, that type of woman. That's the work of the Spirit in your life from the moment that you believe to the day that you die, which is really great news. It means that all of us are a work in progress, right? None of us have arrived. We're all continuing to be changed by the Spirit of God. So Joseph gives Benjamin 5 times as much as everyone else. This is a test. How are they going to respond? And look what happens. This is the last verse of the chapter. I think this is the key. This might be one of my favorite verses in all of the verses that we're reading today. Verse 34. And it says, and they drank and they were merry with him. What is this? This is communion. Right? Communion, by definition, is a shared experience of intimacy. I mean, this is one of those scenes. If this were a movie, I hope you can imagine. I mean, if this is a movie, this is when that emotional music starts to swell up. Right? This is when the dialogue begins to fade and the camera would just begin to slowly pan around the entire table as they're sitting there laughing and smiling. And maybe for the very first time in the entirety of their lives, just enjoying one another's presence. This is exactly what Joseph needed. Right? He needed to be able to enjoy his brothers. He needed to be able to laugh again. He needed to be able to see them smile. You know how a broken relationship is restored? And this is so important. It always begins, listen, it always begins with the healing hand of God. Okay, that's how it always begins. You know, too often we try to skip to things like counseling and therapy, and those things all have their places, but it always it always begins with the healing hand of God. It's God coming close into communion with us, into your weakness, into your pain, into your immaturity, and into all the conflict that you're feeling. And it's God pouring an overwhelming amount of grace into that relationship. I mean, that's how real healing, that's how real reconciliation, that's how real trust is rebuilt. It's God's healing hand being stretched over you. And then look, very practically, you might think this sounds a little bit silly, but if you've ever experienced, you'll know how true this is. You don't know how God usually brings healing into any relationship? Here's how he does it. One new positive memory at a time. One new positive memory at a time. I mean, that's what he does. Look, some of you right now, you're experiencing very real conflict. Right, you've got issues with your parents. You've got issues with friends. You've got issues with siblings. You're in a marriage that, it's been maybe a 3 out of 10 for much longer than you care to admit. And when you look back on the last few months or the past few years, it's easy to feel like, gosh, we got a whole lot more negative memories than we do positive memories. We got a lot more pain than we do pleasure. This is where we are right now. I mean, some of you basically have a scrapbook full of letdowns and disappointments and really nasty fights and hurtful words. And really what you need right now, it's hard to compete with a cute kid, isn't it? You're totally fine. But here's the reality, guys. Listen. What you need right now, more than anything, if that's your life, if you're looking back on the hurt that you've carried and the hurt that you experienced, you need the healing, you need the Spirit of God to extend his healing hand over you and begin creating new positive memories one at a time. Like you need to take the entire scrapbook of hurt and past pain and past disappointment. And some of you need to say, God, I'm bringing this book before you. And I need you to close the book. In fact, some of you, maybe today, you go home today, maybe some of you even need to have that kind of conversation. Now look, to be clear, you have to talk about the book before you close the book, right? Some of you have to have that conversation. Look, here are all the ways that you've hurt me. Here are all the ways that you've let me down. And here are all the ways that I've really screwed things up. And here are the ways that I'm committing to change. Now let's close the book. Let's close the book. In fact, maybe let's burn the book, right? Let's not just close it, let's burn it. Let's get rid of it and let's see what God might do in this next season. Let's let the past be the past. And let's let maybe God start writing a brand new story with our lives and see what he might be able to accomplish. Let's ask the Spirit of God to start healing us and begin a new season that's marked by his grace and marked by his healing. One positive memory at a time. That's what it takes. That's what it takes for anybody. And a few months from now, maybe a year from now, maybe even 2 years from now, you look back on this moment and say, hey, that's when it all began. God began starting to do a new work within us. We closed the book, we burned the book, we got rid of the book, and all of a sudden God started doing something new. And it wasn't perfect. We stumbled through it, we fumbled through it, but one positive memory at a time, God began bringing this sense of restoration into us, a sense of renewal, a sense of rebuilding the trust that we had lost with something better. I don't know what your situation is today. Maybe there's somebody in your life right now that God is bringing to mind. Maybe there's somebody that you're just thinking about. Maybe God wants to begin some of that restoration with, some reconciliation with. Maybe there's someone in your life right now that you need to begin extending forgiveness to. I'm not sure. Here's what I do know. The gospel of Jesus gives us the most beautiful and the most moving picture of communion, right? I mean, it's the most unlikely story of transformation where a perfect God comes down and he reconciles to himself imperfect men and women. He literally comes around a table with them and creates new positive memories. He's saying, hey, we're going to let the past be the past. We're going to put that to rest. I'm going to stand in the gap between you, and I'm going to be the one who actually begins the process of reconciliation through me. That's what Christ does through his blood, through his sacrifice on the cross. And from that moment on, we're invited into a new story. We're invited into a new chapter. We're invited into a new journey of healing that's always initiated by God himself. He invites us today even to come to this table, to eat and to drink and to enjoy his presence, his forgiveness, his grace. And that's the invitation that Jesus has for us now. That any type of reconciliation, any type of healing, any type of restoration that we want to experience in this life first starts with understanding the reconciliation that we have with him. And so we come this morning and we even take communion as a remembrance, reminding ourselves that here's what God has done for me, and here's now how we do that with others. So let's pray, and then we're going to continue to worship and respond. Jesus, oh Lord, we give you thanks this morning for this story. We give you thanks for just the reminder that you desperately love to commune with us. That it's your presence that we seek even right now, because in your presence we find all of the good, godly things that we need in this life. You've told us that. You've promised that every single thing that we need for life and godliness, you have given us. And you have a heart for reconciliation. You have a heart for healing hurt hearts. You have a heart for rebuilding trust where trust has been lost. And so, God, we're praying right now that in this time of response, that this would just be a moment for some of us, that you would allow your Spirit to come close. God, I pray that we would be deeply encouraged right now. Spirit of God, we're asking that you would stir within us even the courage to know how to respond. But God, we're believing in this very moment that you desire to take some of those hard relationships, those past hurts, those past disappointments, some of us who are maybe even in the very thick of discouragement right now as we speak. God, just give us the awareness that you are walking through that with us, that you are present right now. And in the communion that we share with you, God, we are given power and we're given a way to be able to experience that with others. Would you do that now, Father? We're praying these things, believing that you love to provide them.